This is
No
on.
problem. This one's definitely on, and everyone can hear me, right? Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Joelle Gwinner. Thank you, Dr. Ritchie, for the great introduction. So excited to be here today and so excited to have the opportunity to co-present with Chris. As you heard, I have been a market research professional for 20 years now, which is crazy to me. But in my role as Director of Research Innovation, I've actually only been doing it for the last year. And in that role, I'm responsible for looking at technology, tools, trends that really are going to help shape what's next for us as an industry. And in that role, I had my first kind of innovation with this whole concept of AI, right? And all the hype and all of the momentum behind it and everything I've been hearing about it in the research world. I thought, my goodness, what is this and how long before it replaces me in figuring out research innovation, right? And so I've really spent the last year really trying to wrap my mind around what is AI, what's its impact on us as researchers. And I actually thought that I was making progress until I heard our keynote John this morning and realized I still know nothing. But part of my journey in gaining perspective is to have the opportunity to work with individuals like Chris. So I'm thrilled to be able to present with him today, and he's actually going to kickstart us in our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Joelle. I want to go back for just a moment. It seems like I heard we're live tweeting here, so if Joelle or myself says something really interesting, you can see the Twitter handles up there, so take a note. Or likewise, if we say something really dumb, all feedback is good feedback. But really grateful to be here with Joelle. Rama's talk actually, I think, introduced a lot of some of the concepts that we're going to talk about today, and I just jumped ahead. But so take a moment here. So if you're like me, you came to this conference with the notion, I want to learn something. I loved Rama's call to action, kind of what's the thing you're going to take away from this and do differently when you get back to your job. And so think about that. What is the promise of artificial intelligence for you? What are you hoping to do tomorrow because of AI that you can't do today? And so how do Joelle and I define that? It's really a focus on the outcome. Right? How do we get better outcomes, and how do we do that faster? Let's take a market, for example. If we take the healthcare industry, PubMed, which is an index of all the papers for that market, they have 19 million citations. And if you start to do the math, it's a new paper every single minute is published. And so if I'm an oncologist and I'm looking at these 19 million papers, how am I supposed to find something that's going to help me do my job? And not only do my job, do it, but actually to do it better. And that's really, I think, where this notion of this promise of better outcomes comes into play. So think about that. So let's level set on definitions. So does AI equal machine learning? Effectively, AI or artificial intelligence, it's a blanket term that's anything that's used to stimulate intelligence, right? And that simulation can be programmed, or it can also be based on an algorithm. And so is all machine learning? It's not. So what's the difference between AI and machine learning? Machine learning is actually where, as implied by the name, the machine is actually starting to learn with little human intervention. And that's really the big difference. And if we start to think about some of those applications, that was strange.
You predicted that's where you're heading. Yeah.
Actually, we could talk about chatbots here too. This isn't a chatbot, but a chatbot is a really good example. Not all chatbots, but most chatbots are definitely AI. They're simulating intelligence, but they're very rule-based. It's very yes, no. And the machine itself is not actually thinking. Another good example, if you're ever trying to find something on the internet, I can type in a term and it starts serving up other ideas and concepts based on that search. But that's because other people have searched that and other people have clicked on things that they deem important. And what's interesting about Google, especially Google search, is that what helps AI be more successful and more accurate is a very large data set. And there's other examples that you probably bump into every single day that you don't even realize are are AI, right? So the fact that my phone knows when I'm about ready to go home, it knows how long it's going to take. It also can make recommendations on what's the best way to get home. One of my sort of favorites is like my watch. It actually recognizes based on the inputs that I'm giving it, like, hey, it looks like you've started to work out. Do you want to start to record that? And there's lots of things that we're bumping into that again are simulating that human intelligence.
Yeah, and we hear about and we feel it every day, how AI, how machine learning algorithms, how these sorts of services impact us. And for me, again, as a 20-year veteran of the researcher, this caught me a little bit flat-footed as I was trying to figure out, well, what does it mean? How does it impact us? And part of that is because I'm so used to going to my clients. It really thinks that it knows what we want and what we're doing. This is the reality, folks, right here. I'm so used to going to my clients and saying, hey, let me tell you about segmentation and let me tell you why it's important to your business to build strategy, right? I was always helping them, consulting with them. Now I'm in a situation where my clients are already using it. Their systems are already built on it. So now it's well, how are you going to leverage it to connect with what I'm doing to make sure that we're harmonious, to make sure that we're connected, to make sure that we're unified? And I think that's really helped shape the way that I've approached this and really understanding why are we hearing it at every conference we go to? Why is it the number one topic? And what really is the hype behind it? And if you think about the hype behind it, it really does come back to one thing, right? It comes back to big data. And we all know the V's of data, right? And we have big data coming at us, so much of it, so frequently, and in so many different structures. And sometimes the structure is no structure at all, right? And that's the promise of AI. It promises to solve that tension of big data. And in that digital transformation and in that world where we're using our Fitbits and our watches, that source of data, it just keeps growing and growing and growing to the point where, again, it's not humanly possible for us to get in there and look through everything to find those insights. And so that's the promise of AI, right? To get in there and to work with the data that we can't get in and work with ourselves. And if we think about it, there have already been a lot of great successful applications, as well as what I see as emerging applications that really help found the hype behind it. And I call those the 3Ds. The first is drudgery. So again, think of those large, huge volumes of data that, again, sometimes have no structure at all, like social media. AI algorithms, they can get in there and they can start to create some structure to the unstructured, right? It can do some of the things that as researchers we've wanted to do since day one. We want to find patterns. We want to make predictions. We want to apply meaning to those patterns and predictions, right? So it's still the same kinds of things we want to do, but in a world where it's so drudgerous in the volume and structure of data that we need help. Right. So, and this is where we've seen a lot of great applications come through in the customer analytics world, especially and in social media. The next is what I'll call discerning. So you get in there and you apply that structure and you figure out where the patterns are, and now you want to discern some meaning to those patterns, right? You want to start to categorize them. You want to code them. You want to create themes out of them, so ultimately you can do something about it. You can create those predictions. So the discerning applications is where I've seen a lot of the applications have such great success, like the text analysis, sentiment analysis. The passive metering, I think, is really starting to gain some traction of understanding what a person is doing in their online searching to see, well, what can we expect them to do next? And then the last is where I am starting to see some of that emerging application of it, which is really, instead of taking data that's already collected and doing something about it, how can we leverage algorithms to start to decide what are the right questions to be asking? So instead of trying to come up with that 45-minute survey, imagine just a conversation We already see this with chatbots, right? When you go in and you want to find out more about how to make an online reservation, or you have a problem with an experience. Well, imagine that in a survey world now, where you provide information, and then from that information, it decides the next best thing to ask you to really uncover what's underlying the motivations to your answers. So those are the places where I'm starting to see some of the emerging applications. So when we think about the success and we think about the hype, of course it makes complete sense that all signs from our perspective, and more importantly, it feels like directives from leadership are saying, absolutely, not only should we be using it, but how are we using AI? In what ways are we using it to derive new insights? But we're running into some challenges, and Rama really spoke to some of these already. Data literacy is a huge one, right? Data isn't always ready to talk. It's not always set up in a way that we have the right models to go in there and figure out what it's trying to tell us. Not only might the data not be ready to talk, but also the teams might not yet be ready to understand where each other is coming from. Right? So as research professionals, we're grounded in our statistics, we're ready to go with our correlations. All of a sudden, a data scientist comes in with a whole new language, right? And it's starting to require different kinds of conversations, but yet still trying to get to that same common place. And last, it's great to have every algorithm in the world, but we know that an algorithm and data and facts is not insight, right? So we know that insights still take work. Great question up there about can algorithms, are they at a point where we can start to make predictions about new insights? And that's where we are still seeing crazy. We are still seeing the role of human intervention in these algorithms. And that human intervention really gets back to another V that we haven't yet talked about, which is veracity. There's so many platforms out there, so many algorithms out there. The question is, do you trust them to do what you're expecting them to do for the problem you're trying to solve? So a lot of hype, but that's what then starts to get us into the reality of where we are today in our relationship.
Yeah, so let's talk about the reality. So there's clearly a lot of promise for AI. There's some real big, hairy problems to take on with the amount of data that we're dealing with. So we've collected a couple of claims from software solutions specifically targeted for market researchers. So here's my first one. I'll just give you a second to kind of read that, soak it in. Everybody ready to like walk up and leave and go find a new job? Or maybe walk up and go get an adult beverage because you don't have to write a research report ever again in your life. Right, so let's unpack this. When I read this, I was a bit surprised at first, but it is a real claim, and that's so strange. The AI is not working today.
No. It seems to like the word claim.
But let's look at that, right? So let's unpack this claim, though, right? An algorithm can simply learn to make search assumptions and generate a report. So what's an algorithm? We talk about algorithms a lot with AI. It's the way I like to describe it, like the 7th grade answer, it's basically a formula, right? So I can, a simple algorithm would be to determine the circumference of a circle. Whereas a more complex algorithm would be what's the fastest route between two different locations. And then, as we've mentioned already, like the key to an algorithm and its success is the data that's actually being infused into it. So as the data goes through the algorithm, it begins to learn, it begins to reason, and begins to predict. So now we have a model. So what could possibly go wrong? It actually works. The AI is working better. But like this is a funny picture, and every time I show it, it's the room gets the same thing. Like, so we as humans, we look at this image, and it's very clear that some are muffins and some are chihuahuas. But if you're a machine, like, it's actually not that obvious. And we actually need lots and lots of data. We need lots and lots of data. Like, really, for a reliable model, we want over 100,000 data points. So a good question whenever you're evaluating AI or any AI-driven solution is like, what kind of data, where did the data come from, how is it collected, and how much exists there? And so an example of when it actually works right. So if I'm from Austin, right? So if I search the San Antonio Spurs, like Google actually starts to serve up a bunch of other information based on that topic. It doesn't see those as 3 words. It actually starts to see it as a concept. And Google has an advantage because there's literally millions, if not billions of people searching on that platform every single day. There's people that are verifying like that the results that you're providing are correct. But when we're doing something within market research, I did turn off all the animation, so this is very strange. Every single day, like it's being trained, and typically with the studies that we're doing, whether that be in the tech field at IBM where I work with, or Joelle with some of her clients at Burke, like those, we typically don't have hundreds of thousands of data points. That's not to say that AI can't help us, but it's an important thing to know. So sometimes, like when we're working with AI, especially today, like it does feel like we're pushing this gigantic rock up a hill. So let's look at another claim. That one, you're right, it likes that, right? So AI produces higher quality data by removing unconscious human bias. And remember, all things as simple as data. So take a minute, think about that. Like, how does that feel? Does anybody read the paper? Not the paper. We don't read the paper anymore. Like clearly, this notion of bias is a big issue, and it's been in the news a lot lately. But it's actually been around for a while. In 2015, the University of Washington, they did a study about searches on an image search on the internet. So when searching the term CEO, if you were actually to count all these images, 11% of the images are women. But when this study was conducted, actually 27% of global CEOs were women. And they would say, well, it's the algorithm. But so who's training the algorithm, right? It's us whenever we do that search. And so there's a lot of user bias that's being introduced in the results that are being presented. And so while hopefully nobody ever sits down to create a biased study or introduce bias, it's something to definitely be aware of. So we're certainly ready for AI. We've got all this data. What are we supposed to do with it? But is AI ready for us? And the way I like to think about AI is it really is a relationship between us as humans and machines. And so we want that machine to augment our ability, right? Think about those 18 million papers. If I'm an oncologist, how do I make sense of them? But in and of itself, it doesn't, the machine is not going to make me smarter. Like I actually have to put and invest something into it. So we're really talking about a relationship and a relationship of trust. And so when I start to think about trust and what do those relationships look like, there's some work done at the University of Texas. Mark Knapp teaches down there, and he's created this relationship model. There's actually another half to it, but we're not going to talk about the decline of our relationships today. But our goal is we want to trust the information that those AI-powered tools are giving us. So that's at the top. So how do we start, and where are we on this spectrum? Are we just initiating? Have we bonded with these tools? And Joelle and I, our hypothesis, we're actually kind of at the bottom half of it. AI certainly is impacting our lives in ways we can't imagine, but we're still really discovering and validating the authenticity of those results. A perfect example of that is a friend of mine, she posted on Facebook, they had served up an ad for canes. And she's like, I don't have a cane. I don't know anybody with a cane. Why on earth would you give me that ad? So we're still understanding how can we validate what AI is giving back to us.
And that's what's, kind of really exciting now is we know that we're early in a relationship, and early relationships, they're always exciting, they're new, they're fresh, they're different, they're unfamiliar, right? So we have a lot of questions we need to be asking. And again, as a research professional, as I really started to step back and learn about it, I realized that not only are we ready to ask the questions, but we're perfectly equipped to ask the right questions. We've been trained all along to do just that. We just need to reframe the questions with this new set of tools we have. And so how do we do that? Well, importantly, we can determine the fit for AI. So what's the first thing you ask whenever you're asked to create a new research design? What was it? Objectives, right? We start in the exact same spot. And again, as we go through this, it starts to feel more and more familiar and in our comfort territory to say, we need to make sure that we have objectives that align. Think again about those 3 Ds. Are we in a place of trying to seek patterns, predictions, classification, and those drudgerous or discerning types of data sources? Next, do we have the data to support the application? Chris talked about the realities of not having enough data. How much data was used to build an algorithm? How much data was used to train it? And do we know that we have enough to apply it in a particular situation we have? Just like we wouldn't run a segmentation on 100 people, we're not going to want to use a machine learning AI algorithm on 100 people, right? So we have to look for the right fit. And last, that right fit is also dependent on making sure that it's an ongoing application, that continuous flow of data. If it's just a one-time ad hoc project, well, maybe there isn't a need to build that entire tool or system. But if it's something where you know it's a dynamic flow, you know it's continuous, well, then maybe that is the right fit for an AI application. Next, we can also determine the model itself. Hopefully today, as well as if you go to other conferences or talk to others in the industry, there are a lot of platforms already out there that serve a lot of different solutions. And again, if we start to think about our role, we have a responsibility to evaluate the solutions and make sure, again, they're doing what we think they're doing. So we go back to our training, right? We go back to the very things that we ask whenever we're designing our survey. Instead of who is your target audience, think about who was used to train the model. If I were to say, we see the phrase great value in your comments, what's the first theme that comes to mind when you hear great value? Walmart, very good, right? So, but if you go to a generalized model, more often than not, it will classify a comment of great value as something related to price or something related to the literal price value equation. If you're Walmart, that model doesn't work. Right? So now all of a sudden you have to think about who was used to train the model and are those people the right people. Now try taking that great value framework, that model developed in more of a customer goods, now try applying that framework into a healthcare situation, right? It matters who was used, what kind of data was used to train the model. Also, again, we cannot emphasize this enough, how much data was used to train the model. You're not going to feel good about a segmentation on 100 people, just like you wouldn't feel good about a model built on 1,000 people. You want tens of thousands of people to really get in there and make sure you have the right stability and robustness of the models. We often ask ourselves, what methods did we use? Is it a regression? Is it a discrete choice? What kind of tools did we use for the analysis? Well, you can ask those same kinds of questions. What exactly was the model trained to deliver? Is it trained to deliver sentiment? Is it trained to deliver just coded structures of data? Is it trained to make predictions? You can ask these kinds of questions, and the developers of these platforms are eager to share how the model was built. And again, it comes back to what we heard from John this morning, that openness, that transparency. It's there. We should take advantage of it. And last, we always ask about success criteria for our analyses. How confident are we in these results, right? Well, you can start to ask the same things of these solutions in these platforms. There's always validation criteria as well. And in fact, a aha moment for me in my journey and perspective was in talking with someone about text analysis for the same time and looking at early in my journey and trying to apply it to open-end comments in a survey, right? So just general verbatim comments, open ends. We want to try to create codes, apply sentiment, and then feed that into a model to predict NPS, right? So we started having the conversation, well, gosh, how do I know if the codes are right? Well, you can take a code frame and you can feed it in. Well, how do I know if it's doing a good job of the code frame? Well, it'll tell you how often it got it right or wrong. So it'll tell you correct classification and non-correct classification. And then it'll go a step further and it'll say, well, I'm about 80% sure that I correctly classified this. I'm 90% sure that I correctly classified this. If you've been around in the industry long enough and if you've done some segmentation work, well, this starts to sound an awful lot like the kinds of questions we ask when we're developing a typing tool, right? So again, these questions are very familiar to us and we should feel very comfortable asking them of the solutions we see out there. And last, we have an opportunity to bridge teams. Again, we get to that idea of working now, not just with other insights professionals, not just with marketers, but now we're working with the data analytics. We're now working with IT groups, right? So we're now building these platforms, these ways to integrate, and that requires commonality in vision because we know that right now commonality in language isn't quite there. So that allows us to go back to the idea of we're really good in that T of research, right? Well, now let's create that adjacency and be good translators of how we can all work together towards that common goal.
So if we think about all the things that Joelle and I have covered, like, I really like this image because really AI is still pretty new, right? It's a bit like a toddler. So and a toddler's an easier picture to find than an intern. But like if you think about your interns in your organization, right? Like you're not going to have them do a big study and then just expect them to go send it off to the client and it to be wonderful, right? You're going to kind of check the work. You're going to validate like what methods did you use? Like do I trust the data? Does it feel actually correct and accurate? And it's the same way with our AI tools. Like there is tremendous promise there, but it's going to require a significant amount of nurturing for us as we build that relationship and build those bonds with those tools. And I just want to really reiterate like what Joelle said, right? Like who is used to train the model, what data and how much, like that how much is really key. And so if somebody comes to you saying, I've got something that's going to change your life, like you should ask these questions. Like, and then the training too, right? Like if it was trained by somebody in consumer packaged goods, but you're looking for a healthcare solution, that's probably not a good fit, right? And then what are the validation metrics? Like how do we ensure or do our best to remove as much bias as possible? How can we make sure that the information that's feeding back to us is helping us derive those insights and we're not just accepting them blindly without any trust in that. So. Thank you so much. We have, looks like we have a few minutes. Look at that.
Oh,
did it again.
woohoo.
Magically. But it looks like we got time for one and if maybe two if you're really fast questions.
So how would you complete this sentence? AI will never, but then 10 years from now, you'll look back and say, man, I was totally wrong.
AI will never. So I don't know that I would be totally wrong, but I will say AI will never replace me. At IBM, the way we really describe AI, and machine learning, and all these tools that are emerging and coming of age is like augmented intelligence. There's no doubt like AI and automation is going to remove and change the job market quite significantly. But I don't believe in my lifetime that a machine will actually replace the need for that human intervention. I really do see it as a symbiotic relationship. So I'll answer half of your question and let Joelle ask the second half.
What was the second half of the question?
10 years from now, you'll be totally wrong about what
I'll be totally wrong. Okay. I'm going to say something that's probably going to ruffle feathers. I'm going to say AI will not replace traditional survey-based research. But 10 years from now, I think it's going to take a large chunk of it. We're really going to have to redefine the role of our traditional ask-answer survey. And I'm starting to see it almost like a big puzzle, right, where there are so many different pieces. And so now we really have to shape better. What is the piece and the role of survey research? Because we do know that there are platforms out there, there are solutions out there, there are approaches out there in how we think about our behavior data that no longer require us asking some of the questions we used to need to ask. So do I think it will completely eliminate it? I don't know that I'll go that far, but I might be wrong in 10 years. But I do think that we, again, as researchers, have a responsibility to really think about the role of the different kinds of research today when we have so much beyond just traditional survey-based research at our fingertips.